context today. And just to start us off, I'd like to invite our keynote speaker for this session to broadly look at this area and try and open our minds into thinking about climate resilience and natural resources. How do we make our societies resilient to the COVID-19 menace, and how do we recover from here? Yeah, so our keynote address today is Dr. Richard Munang, who's a regional climate coordinator at the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, at the African Regional Climate Change Coordinator. He's also the UNEP ecosystem-based adaptation for food security focal person, and is currently coordinating and guiding that rollout of the UNEP Africa ecosystem-based adaptation for food security. The Food Security Assembly in over 40 countries, and is previously was the policy and program coordinator for the UNEP, UNDP Africa Climate Adaptation Development Program. So welcome, very much welcome, Dr. Munang.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction, and to the representative of the PS, Mr. Oscar, the convener of this timely conference, to everybody who is present here today. It is a great honor for me to join you all for this timely conference, whose theme is actually going to culminate into a book, Africa in the Post-COVID-19 World. This conference congregating experts from diverse fields, joined by a quest for answers to a pressing question of our time, which is how do we accelerate Africa's progress to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and at the same time African Union Agenda 2063 amidst the most daunting global crisis in recent history. As we already know, the year 2020 is set to go down in history as one of the most unprecedented in recent memory. For over 10 months, the entire globe has battled COVID-19 health emergency. The negative impact of this catastrophe has exceeded by over 60% the devastation of the historic 2018 global financial crisis. But as we already know, in no place are these losses that we've seen across the entire globe, and especially in the African continent, more real than in people's pockets. In no place are these losses more real than in dinner tables and kitchen shelves. Beyond being a health crisis, it has moved forward into an economic emergency, threatening to sink Africa further into vulnerability. As we speak today, Africa's GDP will shrink by 1.5%. That's what the data is telling us, and up to about 50% of all jobs in the continent are being wiped out. But even more alarming is the fact that the COVID-19 related stresses are coming in to exacerbate already less than ideal socioeconomic circumstances in the continent. As we speak today, food insecurity is high. 257 million citizens go to bed each and every night hungry. As we speak today, unemployment is another critical challenge where Africa needs to create no less than 12 million jobs each and every year. As we speak today, we are in an economy that is 20 times less productive than competitors in the global economy. These challenges are in addition to climate change, which is the elephant in the room, and which is projected to shrink incomes in most African countries by up to about 75%. As expressed in the latest analysis in a report that was released just a month ago called United in Science, climate change has not stopped for COVID-19. The report made it clear that as the global economy rolls back to life, emissions trajectories will continue to rise towards the dangerous pre-COVID-19 levels of above 2 degrees. A scenario that will only further exacerbate the worsening climate change impacts we see across the continent, the high frequencies of droughts or floods that we have been realizing across the entire African continent. These are existential threats that the COVID-19 global emergency is further compounding. The urgency, therefore, for solutions is at its highest. And for a region that already is highly dependent on natural resources that accounts for up to 77% of total exports and 42% of government revenues, the unequivocal message is that our recovery cannot be pegged on natural resources in the traditional sense. And this then leads me to three fundamental questions that we need to answer as we find solutions through research to this. And the first one is, how do we reimagine? How do we reorganize and redesign Africa's development under the changing climate and the unsettling realities of a COVID-19 world? And the second question is, how do we leverage the efforts to build climate resilience as a strategic approach to rebuild back better and different, more inclusive and sustainable economies that put us on track to realize the African Union Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goals? And the last question is, how can this rebuilding lift the youth from the fangs of unemployment and salvage the informal sector to competitively position Africa at a global level? Answering these questions offers valuable lessons for research, that can inform policy and practical action across the entire African continent. The propositions I will share in the next couple of minutes are pegged on two aspects. And the first is that a reprioritization of natural resources to focus more on the most inclusive elements. And the second aspect is that a strategic consideration of climate action, which is Goal 13 of the Sustainable Development Goal, must be taken as a source of inclusive, productive solutions. So what does it mean to reprioritize natural resources? Traditionally, as we know, whenever we talk of natural resources in the African continent, what comes to mind is the oil and minerals. That is not correct. This is what is paraded in the mainstream, traditional narratives of resources. But what we must understand is that the inclusivity of these areas needs to be understood. How many countries have these minerals? What proportion of the population can be engaged? The answer we know, a tiny minority. But at the same time, two natural resource areas are a universal gift for all 54 African countries. I'm talking of agriculture, where 65% of global arable land and 10% of internal renewable freshwater resources are right here in the African continent. Not to mention being the most inclusive by engaging over 60% of the entire workforce in the agricultural sector. I'm talking of the most universal form of clean energy, solar energy, 365 days of sunshine. This natural abundance, coupled with enabling policies that we see across the entire African continent today. And ready technologies have seen the cost of solar in the continent reduced by over 60% and actually the lowest in the entire globe. But these two most abundant natural resource areas also aligns to Africa's climate action priorities. When you look across the entire continent, with countries, over 93% of countries having ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement, they have a need clean energy, they have a need sustainable agriculture. And what we already know from practical evidence from the ground and from projects across the entire African continent that are undertaken by individual citizens, by organizations strategically applying climate action solutions of clean energy and ecosystem-based adaptation to climate-proof and maximize productivities of Africa agro value chains, offer the shortest route to accelerate the realization of multiple sustainable development goals. This is realized while driving competitive enterprises that create multiple jobs and income opportunities. And studies after studies have shown that using nature-based approaches like agroforestry, mulching, organic fertilizers to grow food increases yields by up to 128% under the changing climate, as well as enhances the food resource base, ensuring the critical ecosystem, for example, pollinators, which are needed for growth of 75% of human food, is actually enhanced, and also linkages in decentralizing clean energy to reverse post-harvest losses in a continent that are worth $48 billion US can actually result in creating up to about 17 million jobs. These are the areas where, if they are actually leveraged, they can address multiple challenges that are plaguing the entire African continent today. Furthermore, when you look beyond the agro value chain and look at waste recovery to domestic clean energy, options of fuel briquettes will go a long way to relieve pressure of our forests and reverse deforestation and land degradation currently costing the entire continent $68 billion each and every year. The clean cooking solutions will create sustainable alternatives to replace the charcoal industry that is worth 20 billion a year. And all these things being addressed in a climate resilient way will create jobs and at the same time build resilient systems for many people. This represents enterprise opportunities. This represents opportunity for the youth that they can tap into. And this represents an opportunity to reduce indoor pollution. Research efforts therefore needs to unlock this multiplicity of opportunities. And for this to happen, I have 4 points to leave you with. And the first is to rebuild under COVID-19 or post-COVID, we must rebuild through the informal sector. This sector accounts for over 80% of all employment in sub-Saharan African region and has been so for a long time. Currently, as we speak today, up to 80% of young workers in nearly all school-to-work transition surveys fall into the category of informal employment. Efforts to rebuild resilient inclusive economies must therefore focus on where majority of the population in the continent draw their livelihoods. And by this, ensure that we have most people productively engaged in productive economic activities. But for this to happen, there are very specific questions that research will need to answer to put in place critical enablers. Among them is the need to make these products or those who produce in this informal sector, when what they produce, how can it be attractive to the local population? Researchers will need to look at what can be done to ensure informal sectors, actors in agriculture and clean energy can tap the 150 billion a year middle class spending in the food sector. Another area that research needs to look at is how can affordable financing be assessed? How can policy be informed to incentivize low-risk financing so that each and everyone, especially the informal sector, can be able to access? Research will need to inform on how locally available technologies of clean energy, like we see you who are developing clean energy solutions like solar dryers, who are turning waste to briquettes. How can incentives be put in place to incentivize to drive this? These are critical areas to ensure post-COVID-19 rebuilding efforts are driven through the lens of the informal sector and hence ensure socioeconomic benefits accrue to this. And that takes me to my second point, which is that actions must target in Africa's catalytic sectors, what Africans have got in abundance, the clean energy sector, because we know that while the informal sector actions emanate from nearly every sector, transformation can only be driven through a strategic focus on the sectors that can be considered catalytic in putting more money in more pockets and food on the table. The agro-value chain, coupled with clean energy solutions, such as locally manufactured solar dryers, such as clean cook stoves, among other sustainable value addition solutions, stands out as the most catalytic. Not only are these inclusive, with agriculture employing over 60% of the population, but the continent holds a significant resource competitive advantage in them. Multidimensional successes are already demonstrated that from these approach opportunities can be created. For example, use of a simple solar dryer that is made using local material can dry rice up to 48 times faster than traditional open sun drying and result not only in cleaner, better quality or more hygienic, but fetches more money in the market. Decentralizing solar dryers to informal food traders in markets across the continent to enable them to dehydrate and preserve their post-harvest remains an opportunity to be tapped. And research efforts should look into specific policy incentives that will be needed to ensure such accessible solutions are scaled out through innovative climate action enterprises. And that takes me to my third point, which is financing must be both low risk and accessible. And I say this because this is a very critical aspect in the continent. Regardless of how we want to build and ensure accessible financing, this must be built and leveraged on institutions that are affordable and accessible by the informal sector, because we know that up to 90% in the informal sector transact in cash and impart the convenience of mobile money. Formal financial structures such as banks are out of their reach. For such, building critical credit history to raise capital through formal finance systems is a tall order. The solution, however, lies in working through the institutions that account for them. And here, communal cooperatives are the way to go. Community cooperatives are proven to work. They are accessible and relevant to the diverse financing needs of the informal sector, having withstood the test of time. This cooperative needs to be leveraged on our structures for traceability and accountability in financing informal sector enterprise development. We are seeing this across the work we do across the continent, where leveraging on cooperatives, communities are setting on what is called village savings and learning association, whereby youth decentralizing solar dryers are helping them to dry using what is called drying centers. So the biggest question for research to look at is research needs to look at specific incentives that can be put in place to position cooperatives across the continent as the financing and accountability engine for post-COVID-19 business recovery. For example, what would be the effect of channeling COVID-19 stimulus packages through cooperatives to target informal sector actors in a low-risk, traceable, and accountable way? And that takes me to my last point, which is prioritizing to invest and nurture selflessness among the young people, the youth. Because we know that a skilled person capable of turning challenges into opportunities is 4 times the value of produced capital and 15 times the value of natural capital. The continent of Africa have a youthful population, over 60%, and they embody Africa's sovereign asset, Africa's sovereign capital. Through our work, we are investing in youth, and what we're noticing is that when youth are structurally guided to continually improve their skills, to adapt their skills and talents and leverage on their creativity, regardless of disciplinary background, they can actually find purpose in driving climate action through guiding them to leverage on their skills and talents and find satisfaction in solutions that touch many lives of the vulnerable, not only looking at financial gains alone. We have leveraged on what we have devised called innovative volunteerism, where willing youth from all walks of life are engaged, and these youth are now establishing enterprises where they're developing mechanical solar dryers, where they're turning waste to briquettes, where they're turning waste to fertilizer. But the bigger question that research must answer, the big question is, how can these intangible assets be tapped? How can the youth be guided to start seeing themselves as solution providers using what they already have, their skills, their talents, their creativity, as opposed to feeling entitled to jobs alone? How can our curriculum in the entire African continent be revamped to start turning at job creators and not job seekers? How can selflessness and fidelity to a cause of touching many lives become the primary motivation of this youth, as opposed to personal enrichment alone? These are critical questions that social research effort in Africa needs to answer. We know that these are not going to be easy because sugarcane is sweetest at its joints. This African proverb tells us that while reaching the joint is not the easiest thing for a sugarcane eater, the sweetness motivates them to action. In a similar vein, orchestrating a paradigm shift in Africa's research efforts to focus on how climate action and natural resources can drive the pathway to rebuild back better, to rebuild back more resilient, inclusive, and competitive economies that accelerate the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals will not be easy. But the results that will come as a result of this, the results that will ensure that there are food secured homes, there are competitive economies, creating inclusive wealth for all and building climate resilience, are worth much more than the effort. Thank you.